Nope. Oh,
Hello. It works.
Very good.
here we go.
The room is so small. We don't need.
So, are we ready to begin?
Sure.
Sure. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. My name is Haralambi Markov, and I'm going to be your moderator for this afternoon. I hail from Sofia, Bulgaria, and I'm very much interested in all things world building. And we'll be discussing exactly this, how to build a world. And with me are 5 incredible authors, and I'd like to introduce them. I'd let them introduce themselves. Let's start with Aliette.
I knew there was going to be some kind of penalty for coming in late. Hi, my name is Aliette de Bodard. I live in France, but I write in English. I've had a couple of novels published. The most recent one is The House of Shattered Wings, which is a gothic dark fantasy set in Paris. And in Spanish, what's been most recently translated was El Ciclo de Julia y Una Estación Roja en la Deriva, que son... that are, I guess, domestic space opera with AIs, families, and sometimes a few explosions. There you go.
Hello, I'm Concha Perea. My first book was La Corte de los Espejos, who was published in fantasy, and I used to write fantasy books. And a week ago, I didn't know I was going to be here, so I'm a little bit nervous just.
So I'm Andrzej Sapkowski. I suppose I don't need to introduce myself to the audience. And if the question is how to write, sorry, I cannot teach. Either you are the writer or you not. There is no alternative, absolutely. And if you ask me how to create a fantasy world, my answer is do not bother. There's no need to create a fantasy world. There's no need. Either you have this inside deep of you or you haven't, so the answer is simply yes or no. And there is really no need to create a world. How young are you? How old are you? To create a world takes sometimes 10 years. And to write a book takes 2 years. So after creating a book without creating a world, you will get your money and you're okay. No problem. So the answer to the question, which is by my way generally stupid question, you do not have a need to creating a world at all. Because what is very important in the story, only the novel, is the action. Is the story itself, is a storytelling. And believe me, storytelling has nothing to do with creating a world. Nothing at all.
And on that
Thank
note, let's move to down the line.
Hi, I'm Charlie Stross. I'm a science fiction writer and sometimes fantasy writer, and I live in Scotland, but like Aliette, I write in English. I'm currently working on, oh God, is it my 25th or my 26th novel? I don't know. Help, I've lost count. I'm trapped in this profession. And yes, I disagree profoundly. I do think that world building is an important thing, although it is of a secondary importance to storytelling. And we're going to get to that later in the discussion after we've all introduced ourselves.
Hi, I'm Sharon Dreamer. I live in Germany. I'm an expatriate American, and I definitely write in English. And I write science fiction and fantasy. And I'm happy to talk about world building because it's one of my most beloved things that I like to do.
Well, thank you all for introducing yourselves, and let's move on to the heart of the matter. What makes a world real to you? Who would like to start the discussion? Yeah, go ahead.
In a nutshell, internal consistency. One of my rules of thumb when working on a fantasy book, either reading somebody else's or working on a background for myself, consider the Dungeons & Dragons rulebooks as a source of world-building material. Become intimately familiar with them, and then reject every trope they come up with as invalid, useless, and retrograde. In particular, never trust a fantasy world where the currency is in precious metals denominated in base 10 or base 100 that are an integer multiple of each other. For example, 10 silver pieces to 1 piece of gold. No, real-world money never worked like that. It's astonishing how much fantasy has traditionally drawn on prior art that wasn't well thought out or was based on poorly understood, cliched understandings of history, and also heavily biased culturally towards a garbled and regurgitated mishmash of European legends, rather than looking beyond Europe for other sources of inspiration. I can go on flailing helplessly in this direction for hours, but not very coherently, so I'm going to pass the mic on. But internal consistency, and don't go for the beaten path that everybody else has walked already.
Yeah.
Okay, he just knocked out my first 2 points, so now I have to think of something else to talk about.
I can talk about something else if you want.
Go ahead, Aliette.
Little details. I think like a lot, like if we take the Dungeons and Dragons rule book again, I love these books for actually like all the creatures and all the stuff that they contain. But for me, what makes a world comes alive is the impression that there's people who have day jobs who have nothing to do with the PC's quest. Like, the quest is going to be your main story, but to me, it's going to feel a lot like window dressing if all I have is people standing very still in the background who don't feel like they're doing anything at all, who feel like cardboard characters, like, you know, peasants cultivating land, people taking meals, people having families, all sorts of things. And if you even, like, think about a basic thing like a meal, what goes into a meal, what kind of ingredients are your staples, because that's going to depend a lot on your local agriculture or what you can import and export, which in turn depends on your trade. And then there's all kinds of societal considerations that go into making a meal. For instance, how do you prepare it? In Vietnam, for instance, leading up to New Year's Eve, there's a lot of dishes that are prepared commonly because they're a lot of work, but they're also an opportunity for people to bicker and share gossip in the kitchen while that happens, both men and women. This is not a particularly female thing. And there are also dishes that keep, because you're going to prepare that a week in advance, and there's no refrigerator or anything. And then the actual way that you're going to have the meal is going to differ. We're used in the West to, when you go to restaurants, for instance, you will have one meal per person. When I go with my grandmother and family to a restaurant in Vietnam, for starters, she will order because she's the eldest. You mostly don't get to pick what you order, and it's going to be a selection of dishes, and you're going to be seen as very selfish if you insist on having only one dish. It's kind of like the biggest faux pas you can commit. So it's very dependent on culture, and it's very dependent on your entire world, and I think that none of this is actually going to make it into the story, but when they're going to sit down and have a meal, it helps to have thought this out, I find, personally.
When my pupils ask me, how can I build a world, I used to say then, what story do you want to tell? And what do you need to tell that story? It's simple. Start with what you need for the story, for the script. And I always say, and then put details in it. Go to the main line first, but then you will need details. You will need something to remain that there is a whole world, not only the places where your history is going to happen. You are going to have a lot of characters, not only your main characters. And I used to say that you can build a world if it's made of plastics. And I have a lot of pupils who used to use role books to write. And I say, okay, it could be fine for the start, but it's like a cartoon. You don't have to write cartoons. You are writing a novel. Make it more vivid, make it more realistic. So you are not only a growth of adventures doing crazy stuff, or killing dragons, or going to find some treasure. There must be something more than that. So I asked them, think about what you need for the story that you are going to tell.
Sharon, did you by any chance come up
Yes,
with something new?
I can take a step back now, and my background is as a scientist. I'm a geophysicist, and when scientists try to describe things that they're researching, it's not too much different than world building in fiction. I mean, it is a little bit, but if you look at it from the point of view of you're trying to make a model of the world, which is what scientists do, and you have to create that model sometimes in science as well as in fiction from scratch. And that's kind of the way that I approach it in fantasy as well as my science, is how do I describe this world so that other people can understand it? And in the process of doing that, in fiction as well as in science, you make discoveries that you might not have made if you went into this world with the notion of how the world is. You have to go in with an open mind. And what she was just saying about writing the story, depending on the story you want to tell, also the characters who populate your story will also determine what kind of a world you're going to build. And to me, it's kind of organic. It comes out of the story and it comes out of the characters, and the world starts to build itself. And that's also how I do science, is I discover things and then I build on the world that I'm trying to describe. So I'm rambling now, but.
So I would defend my position. In my opinion, the storytelling is what matters. World building is nothing. You should not bother with building a world, because the world appears in the storytelling. If you can imagine what a story is, it's like a circus tent. No, imagine a big circus tent standing on a high pole, which is the main things that keeps the circus tent to not fall down. So it's a protagonist, it's a hero. Then you can see the small pegs driven into the ground. They are holding the tent. And then you can imagine the whole circus tent, which is the story. Imagine it. Imagine the pole, the pegs, and the story. There's no place for world building here. Absolutely nothing. It's a story which matters. And if you are a storyteller, you are a writer. Because the writer, the word means individuality. So no writing about dragons and dungeons. My God. You must be individual. You must be unique to write a story. And if you are able to be unique in creating a world, oh, well, thank you. Chapeau bas. But I do not suppose you are able to do it.
So I find this a very interesting statement, and it takes us back to process, actually. And I see the whole metaphor of the tent and the pole as it's all interconnected. So the entire tent can be then argued to be your world, the world of the story itself. And this is like one of the points that I want to bring out, that not necessarily everything we imagine to go into this world, mix it into the story, but it's integral to the fabric, the material of your own storytelling. So I'd like to basically bring this down to like how you work what you create into the actual story. Yeah, Charles,
Okay.
if you want to.
I'd like to use a slightly different metaphor for why we want to do world building. If you've ever been to a theatrical production of a play on a stage with live actors, you'll be familiar with backdrops behind them, unless you had the misfortune to see a Samuel Beckett play. Painted backdrops which can be quite elaborate. And, for example, it's somebody's living room, or it's a piazza in Venice, or some other part of landscape. The interesting point about the theatrical scenery backdrop artist's job is that the job of the backdrop is to imply that there are spaces beyond the edge of the stage. Implied spaces. These are a really important thing in, for example, computer games as well, where there's a whole fertile field of theory around procedurally generating landscapes, but also in fiction. The point of world building, or where we use the term, is to imply that there is a world beyond the characters that we're describing and their story, so that we actually have some idea as to what's going on. If we're dealing with a boat trip down a river, this implies that there are headwaters of the river somewhere, probably up in the hills, but where are the hills? It implies that the river probably has a destination. It may empty into a sea or a lake. What's out there? The existence of a river implies rainfall. Rainfall implies meteorology, which also implies something about the large-scale continental geography of the world the story is set in. Once you have geography, and once you have meteorology, you have climate, and once you have climate and people, you have waves of migration, and this is the determinant of the history of the world you're inventing. And you can gradually, from just one aspect of a world, see how that one voyage on a boat down a river for a few days implies an enormous amount of material all around it in the distance. And when we write a story, we're basically painting a picture with a frame around it. World building is, as much as anything, about what happens outside the frame, and which can take our story into a whole new area if we end up writing a sequel or continuing beyond the initial boat trip down a river, so to speak. And this is why I find it very useful to establish a set of rules and ideas about how a world works before I begin writing. It allows me to understand the stage, the size of the backdrop I'm setting the stage play in front of, and if necessary, to move the backdrop continuously without inconsistencies, without glitches or breaks in the scenery.
Those are some good points, and I'm a complete spontaneous writer. I don't plan ahead of time, but that requires me to do what he's saying. When I'm taking a boat trip down the river, I have to go and think about all those things, and if I haven't put them into the story to begin with, I have to at some point go back and go back and go back. So that's how I do that. Yes, it's much easier than it used to be. What was the question again?
How much of your world building gets into the story?
Maybe, I don't know, 20% at the most, because by the time you start thinking about all these things, one of my rules is, for world building, is don't be boring. And if you put in all the stuff you researched and all the stuff that you thought about your world, your readers are just going to go, no, and run away.
I suffered for this
Yeah.
research, you will
Yeah.
suffer too.
I was about to say, Turkey City Lexicon, I've suffered for my research and world building. You will now be subjected to it all. The doors to the lecture theatre are locked. There will be an exam at the end of the book.
I tend to think of it as icebergs, really personally, which is like 90% of it is like underwater. You don't really see it, but if you didn't have that 90% underwater, for me, I can't make the iceberg actually float. And it's, as Haralambi was saying, it's really, really personal process. So everybody has their own idea about how to put up a tent, and part of, the way I view it is like, you have to find something that works for you, and if that's what works for you, then it's the thing that works for you, right? So if you want to put the poles first and then the rest of the tent over it, it doesn't really matter. Or if you want to put, the tarp first and then the poles, as long as the tent's standing by the end of it, nobody's going to check exactly how you put it up. I tend to front load a lot. I will research a lot of things. I will try to, like Charlie, to have an idea of how the world works, how the characters are going to think as a result of how the world works. When they're taking that boat ride down the river, what does the river look like exactly? Where is it going? It's partly for internal consistency, but it's also partly because when I reach for detail, the very first thing that I tend to reach for is going to be a cliche. So if I'm not really careful about having some kind of background that's going on, I'm going to reach for the latest thing that was on TV or the horrible trope that everybody's used 15 different times in the past 2 years, and everybody's going to go, oh no, not again. So I really want to have things blocked in. It doesn't necessarily mean that I lock myself into, I'm not working out everything, nobody can. But part of it is making sure that I've got enough detail that I feel okay, the backdrop's working out. Now we can move on to the serious business of characters actually doing some stuff.
And I'm studying history, so it's a very useful career to play trivial. And I love to research. I love to find this piece of history or that place or that civilization that nobody knows or is not almost known. I think they are a great way to me to work. And I'm not a heavy planner, but I used to, how can I say, to collect a lot of information about elder civilizations, about mythologies, about economics, and I love politics. I think that it's a good way to start to work, think about the way of your work rules, how it works, who is the boss, and why is he the boss. And I start to making questions about the work I want to work. And I start to ask, and I start to looking in history books or looking mythology books to find what I need. At the end, I have a lot of stuff. I can use all them, and they are like a puzzle. But I start to put in order, and sometimes I have very interesting things, and other times I have nothing. But I always use this stuff later, or perhaps not in this novel, perhaps in others in the future. But I like a lot to research and to investigate in history.
Yeah. On a related note, research. Okay, I write for a living. This means I don't have time to take a year out to research a particular area. So what I try to do is always research the next book or the one after next while I'm writing an earlier book in my spare time. Side effect of it being the day job rather than a hobby. And this results in me reading eclectically and researching the most strange things that come. And to put it in perspective, Ken MacLeod, another Scottish SF writer, has a rather insightful saying about science fiction. The secret weapon of science fiction is history. It's astonishing the things you can find in strange corners of history that you can recycle in a science fiction or fantasy novel. Events, people, settings, bizarre, totally strange events in human affairs. If anybody here remembers the great tulip bubble of the late 18th century and its economic impact.
I was alive back then.
Fun times.
Yeah. And the strange personalities that crop up that you can just loot and just drop into your novel at random when you want somebody utterly implausible to come along and blow the plot up. Thank you. I'm dealing with one of those right now, very irritating person. This is the flip side of world building from the bottom up. Instead of just designing it from your boat on a river and working out the geography, you're reading eclectically, coming up with a whole load of interesting tidbits from all over the place, and assembling a sort of bricolage or mass of clippings which gradually form a picture together, but which need, again, as I keep coming back to this, they need to be consistent with one another.
Oh, I have something on that. That's a very good point. And I just finished a short story that's historical. It's not fantasy, but despite what kind of fiction you write, you're going to be creating a world, especially if it's another time than which you live, like the tulip bubble. I was writing the story in medieval Cologne, where I live near, and was trying to build up the world in my mind. So the first thing I did was read another novel by Frank Schätzing called Death and the Devil. I don't know if you're familiar with it, set in medieval Cologne. But I didn't want to steal his world. I just wanted to get enough ideas, and that was part of my research, about how he viewed medieval Cologne. I mean, there was a real medieval Cologne, then there's how we think of medieval Cologne, and everyone who thinks of it is going to think of a different medieval Cologne. So then I went back and started building my world based on how he described his, got some useful ideas, so I didn't steal from him, but I did ease into my own world by using his. So I think that's an example of kind of what you're talking about.
Sort of. That's one way of doing it. Another, somewhat cruder way, is Charlie's law of writing a fantasy world, which is, number one, steal from the best.
Yeah, I was going to ask about
Another couple of rules that go on with that,
yourself.
though. Never steal from just one of the best. Steal from two or more and mix them up so you don't look derivative or imitative.
Yeah, make sure the bodies
Yep.
are well hidden.
Yep.
Yeah, so
And
next question,
carry
who
on-
did you steal from?
Wait, I hadn't finished. This is part of a set of rules. Rule number 3, only steal from the dead. Firstly, they're not alive and competing with you.
No lawsuits.
No lawsuits. Secondly, it gives you a chance to evaluate whether or not they've stood the test of time. 95% of writers go out of print within 5 years of their death. If they're still in print a generation later, then they said something to people.
You will never make a career in Poland. every point for you. They know everything.
So those are the first 3 rules. Steal from the best, steal only from the dead best, steal from 2 or more of them and mix it up. A little bit of originality on top goes a very, very long way, and I forget what law number 5 was, so it can't be very important.
If
But
they're not dead, make sure they are.
yeah, and I should just like to say, book 7 of a series I've got out of this set of rules comes out in January.
Never try to publish your book in Poland.
Too late. Too late.
They will point you point for point.
All right. So there was a lot of mention of historical research and scientific research, and I know that Sharon is a geophysicist. No.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Good. And that Aliette has done a lot of technical writing and in a computer engineer as well. Yeah, I was going to mention that as well. So, how much do actual sciences help you into? Though we discussed this a little bit, but your particular fields of expertise, or getting a reach out to specialists in that regard.
Okay.
Yeah.
My particular field, I also do archaeoseismological research, which does involve quite a bit of history. So for me, it's extremely important, and I always try to put earthquakes in there somewhere. It doesn't matter what I'm writing, and just the way I'm built. And yeah, it's very important for me. And it also colors my research if I'm writing a story that takes place in a past time, even if it's a fantasy. I try to keep as much of the story scientifically, even in fantasy, plausible, and also historically plausible as possible. You're never going to be able to be 100% historically accurate. I think all of us would agree there, but it's good to align yourself, at least along those guidelines.
I tend to think of the scientific background in my story as something nice to have, but one of the things that I'm very much aware of being a computer engineer is science is a thing that moves, and science is a thing that changes a lot. So, I mean, just if you look back to the 19th century, they didn't have quantum physics, they didn't have string theory, and they didn't have general relativity either. And if you took somebody from the beginning, say the beginning of the 19th century, and told them about quantum theory, you would have to do a lot of explaining, and they might look at you very strangely. They might say, okay, I can see that being plausible, but you're going to have to demonstrate. So now take this and imagine that you're writing a novel that is 10 centuries into the future. You might as well be speaking another language, really. So for me, it's not so much about making sure that the science is accurate as making sure that the reader doesn't look at my book and go, wait. I mean, if we go back to the analogy of having the painted backdrops, if your painted backdrop has a house that's upside down, and that was not your intent, because it could be totally your intent to, I don't know, set the stage or something, but if your intent is not to have people stare at the house that's upside down the entire time, then you should make damn well sure it's not upside down.
A variant on that? I keep going on about consistency. Perhaps to explain a bit more about what I mean, getting the science right for something 1,000 years hence is nearly impossible. What we can do is not get the science blatantly wrong in something that is nailed down and well agreed on. The speed of light is considerably faster than the speed of sound. The Earth orbits the Sun, and I think that these things are more or less invariant. So it behooves us to play by those rules that are already established, or to give a very good convincing reason why we're breaking them.
Well, I mean, sometimes the point of it is breaking the rules. I mean, and sometimes, there's just, let's take Star Wars, for instance. I love Star Wars, but the point of Star Wars is not to tell you something that's scientifically accurate, and that's fine, and I love Doctor Who, and that also has the science is kind of like this background thing, and it does weird and wonderful things. If I'm going to write a novel where my main selling point to the reader is going to be I'm going to accurately depict science or make my best prediction as to what science is going to be like in 5 centuries, then yeah, I should get the science right. But sometimes, the science is not the main attraction, and you just want to make other fun things, which I can get behind.
I completely agree. And if you think some kind of histories in science, no science fiction, so opera works perfectly without science. It's very funny. It could be a very good story, but it doesn't have any science at all. But I think that it's always a good idea to have a bit of realistic, even when you write fantasy. And I used to say that if you have you are going to tell how your character are building a bridge, you must to know how a bridge is built. It's important. When I say later, the detail. If you have the details, you have your story, you have your recreation, and it's going to make it for the reader easier to see what you are telling. So use what you need to tell your history, but use it well.
Okay. And we've heard a lot about how you approach world building in your careers now, but I'd like to sort of hear a bit of an introspective as to how your world building has changed since you first starting writing, and what the skills that you've picked up in that sort of direction to make it stronger, to make the suspension of disbelief, something that no reader can argue against.
What was the last part of that question?
Oh, I didn't want to just repeat that the suspension of disbelief be strong, but that's kind of the gist of what I was going with.
Okay.
Anyone?
Hard one there. Thinking.
Okay, I'll say something. I'll throw it out there. When I first started writing, I completed last year the 5th book in my first series, so I haven't been at it as long as some of the writers here. But when I first started out writing that first book, I thought I needed to know it all right then. So I just dove into the research, dove into all different kinds of things that were not going to make it into the book, but I thought I needed to know. By the time I got to the fifth book, and then I'd already started researching some other series, I realized that for me, as a writer, I've grown enough to where I think it has to grow out of character. I think I mentioned this already. Grows out of character and the type of story that you're trying to tell. And that will kind of guide you in the research that you're going to do. And the one thing that's important for me is I started one project that I have finished for several years, and I realize it's because I don't like the world I've built. So it's, for me, one important factor is you've got to live with this world for as long as it takes you to write the book or the series. You really need to like being in there. So that's an important consideration.
Yep, I've remembered, that's actually rule 5 of Charlie's ad hoc rules for writing a fantasy series. Never volunteer to write a multi-book series that you're not at the very least half in love with, because you'll be stuck with it for years.
Yeah, I think the most important thing that I learned, and I sadly don't think there's many shortcuts for that, is actually how to get a lot of information across in as few words as possible. Yes, one of the things that I did learn was the more you're fighting against the reader's preconception of something, so for instance, if I'm writing a fantasy that is very much like Tolkien, for instance, I can say, for instance, elves, I can say hobbits, and you're going to come up with a mental image, and I don't need to work very hard as a writer. I don't need to put very many words into play to get that image across. If what I really want to say is my elves are really small, they have wings, and I don't know, they hate sunlight, or whatever, I'm going to have to put a lot more work into it. It's a little bit like pushing back against a wall. The wall is like very much harder if you're fighting against something that people do not consider intuitive. So the more your world goes away from what people are, comfortable is not the word I'm looking for, familiar with. Like if I'm writing a story that's set in the 21st century in Spain, for instance, I don't need very many words. If it's in 25th century on a space station orbiting Jupiter, a little more work. 32nd century Vietnamese galactic space empire with a Confucian state system. For somebody who's not familiar with any of those things, I'm going to spend a lot of time explaining things, and you kind of have to do it gracefully without inflicting all your research or all your world building on the reader.
Anyone else would like to add to this?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh.
Good learning, gentlemen. Steal from the dead, steal from the best, and be unique.
I was just going to say to Aliette's point about elves, yeah, I did this in my last novel published, The Nightmare Stacks. It features an invasion of elves, and it's framed as contemporary techno-thriller. And boy, oh boy, oh boy, did I have to do a lot of work laying the groundwork for the readers to believe in these particular elves. And the metaphor I used is, we have a lot of legends about elves. They are as accurate a guide to the reality as, let's suppose you're trying to learn about Washington, D.C. politics from an illiterate Afghan goat herd who's been kidnapped by SEAL Team 6 on their way through his village and interrogated for a few days before they realized he didn't know anything useful about the Taliban. All we know about elves is the equivalent is learned from the illiterate medieval peasants who they kidnapped, used for a while, and who were so lacking in value they were allowed to go home.
And because we have 7 or 8 minutes left, I'd like to open the grounds for questions. If anyone has any sort of questions from the public. Okay. Do we have a mic?
I can try shouting.
Oh, I think we have a mic.
Oh no, I'll shout.
Yeah, okay.
Just just a comment more. I think it's important when creating a fantasy world or something that you put things into it, people, places, past, present, that don't have anything to do with the story you're making. So make it seem like this is taking place in a larger world that has a history, places, people that are not essential to the story, but just there.
Yeah, your world needs to be seamless.
Although I would put a caveat to that, which is that there's also a set of expectations on epic fantasy that you're going to have a lot of details about the world that are given in the story. I know when I wrote my novel, the gothic dark fantasy, The House of Shattered Wings, I did a lot of very casual world building, and I mentioned all those places that serve to prop up the world building. And I know that for some people, it was very frustrating because what they really wanted was like a deeper look at all those places. Not necessarily at all, but at some of those places that I mentioned. And I can totally see why they would want that. It's just didn't happen to be the kind of book that I wanted to write, but it's a thing that exists.
But the defendant pleads not guilty. Everything in my story serves the storyline.
Any other questions? We have time for 2 more. 1 more. Okay, 1 more. Brave souls ask. Okay, we have one there.
Charlie, I know it's something you've spoken about before, but would you mind saying a few words about the perils of writing in a near-future setting?
I expected such question.
Yeah, I had to rewrite the last novel I handed in very hastily at the last moment because Brexit broke my political subplot. I had an entire plot of light, humorous British bureaucratic political comedy, and then Brexit happened and satire is dead. The novel in that series before that had a lengthy subplot involving superheroes and their relationship with the government, and an arm of the police called the Association of Chief Police Officers. Between the manuscript being finalized and it being published, ACPO was abolished. This is the peril of writing about the present.
The defendant here pleads not guilty.
And this wraps our panel. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much to the authors who spoke so eloquently on the subject. And I hope you've learned a lot about how to build a world. Thank you.